Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the righteous shall live by faith. But what does a life of faith look like? Join us as we meditate on the wisdom literature of ancient Israel and the teaching of the apostles of Jesus Christ. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today as we discuss Acts chapters 19 through 23. I'm Paul Ashleman, joined by Clint and Sarah Fichter, with a special thanks to Rodney Pelsey for recording and editing this episode. Join us once again as we learn more about the Apostle Paul continuing his preaching despite the perils of his journey towards Jerusalem. Let's jump right in.
You know, Paul, when I started digging into this week's reading plan in Acts 19 through 23, I find myself feeling super disoriented. I don't know why, but I kept asking myself, where are we at here and what is even going on in the timeline?
You know, I think when you're studying a book with so many narratives, it's really easy to get lost in the details.
Yeah, I agree. I think it might be helpful to do another bird's eye overview, mainly focusing on Paul's 3 missionary journeys, because I think that can get a little confusing. Sound okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
As we've mentioned many times, the book of Acts is a series of narratives born out of Jesus' Great Commission, which is
to be witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth.
Right. And we've already studied a lot of this. The new believers have been filled with the Holy Spirit, and the good news is being spread to both Jew and Gentile in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria.
So, would the phrase to the ends of the earth encompass Paul's 3 missionary journeys, Sarah?
Yeah, that's how I understand it to be. The ends of the earth were the known places of the ancient world at that time. So how about we talk about where each missionary journey can be found in the book of Acts, where Paul traveled on his missionary journeys, and how long he was gone. Might be a good idea to take some notes here.
Got my pen and paper ready. Sounds like a plan.
All right. Paul's first missionary journey occurred approximately 13 to 15 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. We can read about it starting in Acts 13, verse 4, going through Acts 14, verse 26. In this journey, Paul and Barnabas traveled to Syria, then to Cyprus, and to Asia Minor, spreading the gospel and strengthening the churches along the way. It's estimated the first missionary journey lasted approximately 1 to 1.5 years.
What about the second missionary journey?
Okay, remember we talked about in a previous episode that Paul and Barnabas took some time to rest in their home church Antioch after the first missionary journey? Well, maybe a year later, Paul and Silas set out for the second missionary journey. We can read about that starting in Acts 15, verse 36, going through Acts 18, verse 22.
This was from our reading plan last week, right?
Yeah, that's right. This second missionary journey took them all over the place. First on the agenda was revisiting some places in Asia Minor. Then they crossed into Europe and hit cities in Athens, Corinth, and southern Greece. They also sailed to Ephesus, Caesarea, and the church in Jerusalem before returning to their home base in Antioch. You know, I love how knowledgeable I sounded right there. I actually am terrible at geography and I have no idea what I'm talking about.
We all have our gifts.
Yeah, I'm glad. The second missionary journey is estimated to have lasted around 2.5 years.
Let's talk about the third missionary journey. Where could that be found in the Bible?
Okay, now we're into this week's reading plan. The third missionary journey can be found starting in Acts 18, verse 22, going through Acts 21, verse 17. It is estimated that Paul set out on this journey only a few weeks to a few months after completing his second missionary journey.
Whoa, that's intense. So where did he travel this time, geography expert?
You mean this expert who can copy and paste from esv.org? Okay, Paul actually traveled much of the same ground he did in his previous journey. He spent 4 to 5 years traveling through places like Galatia and Ephesus, and then through Macedonia, Achaia, and Jerusalem to once again strengthen some of the churches.
And we know that this missionary journey didn't have a nice resting spot in Antioch. Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, eventually imprisoned, and then he was martyred in Rome for the name of Jesus.
Yeah, that's right, Paul. It's sobering, isn't it? Listeners, there are a lot of great narratives to study within these 3 missionary journeys, but I hope this helped orient us a little bit as we finish out the book of Acts.
I noticed Paul preached a sermon in this week's reading. It made me wonder how many sermons were preached in the book of Acts. Sarah, do you have any guesses?
Maybe 4 sermons?
Not quite. Actually, Peter had 3 sermons, Stephen had 1 sermon, and Paul had 6 sermons.
Wow, I did not expect it to be that many.
Yeah, same here. You know, as I read Paul's sermon in Acts 22, I thought it would be interesting to look at the other sermons to see the differences and similarities.
Yeah, great idea.
So let's set the stage. Paul was in Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey when certain Jews from Asia saw him and tried to kill him. This caused an uproar which led to Paul's arrest. As he was being led away, he asked one of the soldiers if he could talk to the crowd. After asking Paul some questions, the soldier allowed him to speak. He begins the sermon by pleading with the Jews to listen to him. But in Acts 22:2, he does something brilliant. Could you read this for us, Sarah?
Sure. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet.
When Paul spoke to them in their heart language, the people quieted down and listened. As a modern-day example, Ethnos 360 is a mission organization that sends missionaries to unreached people groups and tribes. Our church has sent Nathan and Rachel Mueller to the Malayali tribe through this organization, and they are required to learn the local language before sharing the gospel with the tribe. Why? So they can more effectively communicate the message to the local people. In light of this, see how Paul carefully chooses the language he uses before sharing his defense with the Jews in Jerusalem.
This really highlights the importance of speaking to people in a way they will understand you.
Exactly. And once they are willing to listen, then it's time to deliver the message. Okay, back to Acts 22. First, Paul shares his credentials because this would connect with Jewish crowd. Next, Paul talks about his conversion to Christianity. How do we know the crowd understood Paul's message? Because they became very angry when he spoke of taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Now notice Acts 17. Paul is not speaking to a Jewish crowd, but to a group of Gentiles in Athens. He does not give his credentials because they would have little value to this crowd. Instead, he argues that there's just one God. He even quotes their own poets, and finally ends with the resurrection of Jesus. Sarah, could you please read 1 Corinthians 9:20 through 22?
Sure. This is Paul speaking to the Corinthians, and it is a tongue twister. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some.
You know, sometimes it's easy to read these verses and think Paul is just being a chameleon. But I would argue that he has a more focused plan. He structured his presentation of the gospel for maximum understanding from his audience.
That is really powerful. So what about his other sermons?
Well, if you read all 6 of his sermons, you'll notice God or Jesus was always central to the sermon. He never compromised the gospel. However, we don't have time to review each one, but I'd encourage the readers to do their own study on Paul's sermons in Acts.
So, Clint, I was thinking the other day, what does it mean to be like Christ?
I'm sure we could talk about a lot of different things, but my mind goes to the fruit of the Spirit. We even referenced that last week when we talked about the church in Galatia.
I know, I think about that too, but I also think that being Christ-like conveys a willingness to suffer like he did too.
Oh, I don't often think about that. But 2 Timothy 3:12 does say that anyone who wants to live godly in Jesus will suffer persecution. Sounds like suffering is pretty much a money-back guarantee if you're truly devoted to picking up the cross and following him.
Correct, and Paul's calling was no different. Think back to Acts 9:16 when Jesus told Ananias that Paul would suffer many things for his name. There's actually a lot of parallels between the journeys of Paul and Jesus in this week's reading, especially in terms of suffering, but also some uplifting ones too.
For sure, like how people were healed by simply touching Paul's handkerchiefs and aprons, just like the woman with the blood issue in Mark 5.
And we can't forget about Paul's raising of Eutychus from the dead in Acts 20. Jesus did similar things in Luke 7 and 8.
These stories make me smile thinking about the impact of those people. But you started this section talking about suffering. What parallels do you notice between the sufferings of Paul and Jesus in these chapters?
In chapters 20 and 21, we see Paul compelled to go to Jerusalem, but also repeatedly warned of what would happen if he does. A prophet named Agabus even takes Paul's belt and foretells of his upcoming bondage at the hands of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. Reading through Luke 9:22, we see that Jesus also foretold of his upcoming suffering, alluding back to that suffering servant that we talked about in our second episode on Acts involving Isaiah 53.
And Agabus also mentioned that Paul would be handed over to the Gentiles, just like Jesus.
Just take a look at Luke 18:31-32. We see that Jesus predicted that very same thing.
I imagine there are more parallels in this section, right?
Yeah, both Jesus and Paul are brought before the same Sanhedrin group in Luke 22 and Acts 22, respectively. But even looking at the people's reaction to their ministries, we can find similarities. Think about it. What do you find similar between the ministries of Jesus and Paul?
Well, thinking about Paul's title as Apostle to the Gentiles, I would say both were concerning themselves with reconciling the Gentiles to God. Well, really all people, but I think you get what I mean.
Totally, yeah. And Paul speaks to that point in Acts 22:21-22 when he was talking to the angry mob. What was their reaction to this again?
They shouted to get rid of him.
Yeah, you and Sarah even talked about that in an earlier section. Now, take a peek back at Luke 4:14-30. Here we see Jesus alluding to his outreach to the Gentiles. What was the crowd's reaction to that?
Well, they were furious and drove him out of town. They even wanted to throw him off a cliff. We also can't forget about the crowd's reaction during Jesus' crucifixion in Luke 23 and how similar it is to this example.
Yikes. And of course, there are more examples of similarities between the lives and journeys of both Paul and Jesus that I would be remiss if I didn't encourage our wonderful listeners to uncover and reflect on. We'll even see even more parallels between Paul's trials and that of Jesus in next week's reading.
In the meantime, we've been given a lot to reflect on about what it means to live like Jesus. What a great time to ponder Matthew 16:24.
It's hard to believe that next week we'll already be wrapping up our journey through Acts. Paul's about to face literal trials amidst his treacherous travels to Rome.
Wait, Paul, careful not to spoil the ending.
I have a feeling that we could give away everything that happens next and we'd still have a lot to unpack together.
That seems to be the way it's gone so far. I, for one, have thoroughly been enjoying learning more about the exciting people and places in the book. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us today on the Bluffton Biblecast. We look forward to seeing you once again next week as we conclude the book of Acts.